Welcome to the Savannah Sideways podcast, the strange story of Savannah's ancient Roman statuary. I am your host, Jessica Leigh Lebos. Episode 3, In Turpentine We Trust. At the end of the last episode, we had wound our way from the colonial founding of Georgia and its historical heroes to the beginning of the 20th century, when the city of Savannah was picking itself up out of the post-Civil War economic and cultural swamp and building physical and social infrastructure that made it a shining Southern example of the progressive era. Now, this nationwide investment in the working class was implemented by bespectacled cowboy populist President Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted to clean up the chaotic evil caused by the corruption and political scandals of the Gilded Age. Mark Twain was the one who coined that term as the title of an 1873 novel satirizing the excessive consumption and moral rot of the country's top 1% at the time. The protagonists were based on the elite class of real-life American businessmen, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, all those glamorous names, as well as a lesser-known Canadian named Spencer Schotter, who built a magnificent estate outside Savannah on the piece of storied land called Greenwich. Schotter and his fellow titans of various industries, banking, steel, railroads, oil, were able to amass the kind of wealth only previously enjoyed by monarchs by creating monopolies and trusts that funneled profits into the hands of a very few. This was helped along even further by the Tariff Act of 1890 that imposed as much as 50% fees on imports that prevented foreign competition and drove up consumer prices. Excuse me. To the point that people took to the streets to demand that President Roosevelt do something to rein in all this unchecked capitalism. I know you're probably wondering what any of this has to do with a bunch of old statues, and I promise we're going to get there. But like Savannah historian and Gullah Geechee storyteller Sister Pat Gunn always says, you got to set the table. So let's talk about how Spencer Schotter made the money to set his table. As I mentioned before, Schotter's game was naval stores. This encompassed all the products derived from pine trees used in shipbuilding and maintenance. Substances like tar and pitch were essential to the waterproofing of wooden ships, and later the widespread use of turpentine and rosin put naval stores in constant global demand by the time Schotter moved to Savannah in the mid-1880s. In fact, after securing a charter and establishing the Board of Trade, Savannah had become the #1 naval stores port in the world, fed by Georgia's seemingly inexhaustible supply of old-growth longleaf pine forests. Thomas Gamble, a gentleman journalist and 6-term Savannah mayor, reported in the 1921 book, Naval Stores, History, Production, and Consumption, that American naval stores jumped 600% between 1876 and 1883. And later brought in $10 million in 1 year, close to $1 billion in today's value, leading Gamble to exult, "Never again in the history of the world, in all human probability, will any port equal the astounding record of the season of 1897. Gamble's exuberance aside, it really isn't possible to overstate the importance that naval stores had on the local and regional economy, and eventually the national and global ones. It generated thousands of jobs and helped justify all that investment into Savannah's infrastructure. Landowners finally had a use for the scrubby soil that didn't take to agriculture. It's even been suggested that Georgia's status as the peach state might actually be a misconstruence of the word pitch. The two words do sound awfully alike around here. I'm not here to diminish the value that turpentine had on culture and history, and many Georgians can trace back their ancestry to this pivotal industry. But it is important to recognize that those credited for its success didn't do it themselves, and that it didn't come at great cost to the bodies who performed the labor and to the land itself. Once upon a time, the southeastern United States was covered in massive swaths of longleaf pine forests, a hardy grand species that lives up to 500 years and is dependent on natural wildfires to fertilize its seeds. The longleaf ecosystem hosts an enormous variety of wildlife, from the red-cockaded woodpecker to the gopher tortoise that digs a shelter for hundreds of other animals, to the fox squirrel, which I've never seen but I'm told can get as big as a dog. 90 million acres of longleaf pines still stretched from Virginia to Texas when colonists arrived and began tapping their trunks for British naval ships. After American independence, tar and pitch collected in North Carolina dominated the market, and by the 1840s, they were that state's #1 commodity. That's where the North Carolina nickname Tar Heel comes from.
That's the material that you would have, put on the outside and sometimes on the inside of your ship hull to make sure that you didn't sink. It would have been embedded into cotton fabric that could have been packed in between the seams of the planks on the boats. It would have been used to cover the ropes and the rigging that was used on all ships. So it was kind of this, jack of all trades substance for the naval industry. And most of that pitch was initially produced in North Carolina.
That's Dr. Drew Swanson, another professor of history at Georgia Southern University. He focuses on Southern environmental history, and he reminded me that Spencer Schotter actually got his start in Wilmington, North Carolina before moving to Savannah.
So in that way, he's kind of typical of what's happening, because this industry will move from North Carolina kind of steadily post-war into Georgia and then keep spreading through the South, basically following that longleaf forest.
By following, Dr. Swanson means looking for new trees to feed the beasts. By 1890, it's estimated that 90% of North Carolina's longleaf pines had been tapped out, so Schotter and the industry had to move on.
Kind of using up the forest resources is a big part of the story. Maybe it's twofold, right? They're running through that North Carolina forest and looking for more virgin longleaf forest, because the kind of accepted thing was that you could produce higher quality naval stores from forests that hadn't been tapped before. Once you've worked a tree for a few years, the quality of the product was thought to then go down. So North Carolina's kind of hit first and hardest. By the later 1800s, they're moving into Georgia as kind of the new frontier. Savannah becomes a major hub of this. And from there, spreading west along the Gulf, headed toward Texas, and down south into Florida as well. So I think Schotter is part of that kind of moving wave. The other part of that expansion story is just that the industry was getting larger and larger. And so North Carolina wasn't going to be able to satisfy it alone. They're looking for new pine forests to make that expansion possible.
We're not just talking about domestic supply. The rest of the world had its eyes on the pristine American forest, and the industry titans were happy to oblige.
A number of European nations, of course, have been producing these things before, and they're running through their forests as well. But from the kind of global perspective, like the longleaf forest, vast longleaf forest of the American South, was like potentially the greatest place on the globe to produce naval stores, right? So you see a lot of that language that talks about this as a place that's, this vast untapped resource that'll float all the boats in the world.
Now, the process of collecting pitch and such didn't start out as some giant maw eating up all the trees. At first, it just came from dead wood on the forest floor, and folks would haul fallen branches and burn it slowly until the resin poured out, then cook it down into tar or another form. But then turpentine started peaking, and that's when things got unsustainable. Even as shipbuilding waned, there were plenty more uses for this highly labor-intensive and apparently versatile substance.
You can find it being advertised to do everything. People are drinking it in small amounts as a curative and mixing all kinds of herbal elements in it and rubbing it all over their body, and just all kinds of things that you look at now and you say, well, that's a terrible idea. But then increasingly, it's becoming a kind of industrial substance too. Maybe most famously for like heat and light. So if you mix turpentine with some other substances, you can make like a really clean burning and bright torchlight or gas light. So turpentine is kind of one of those substances that's fitting in well to the growing industrial economy of the Gilded Age, like the petroleum of its day, if you will.
Turpentine production skyrocketed in the 1890s to keep up with demand. Hundreds of crews would go out and do what was called boxing the tree. They would cut a notch at the bottom, then make 2 diagonal slashes that prompted the tree to start pumping resin to heal the wound. Each season, a new set of cuts was made, and these chevron-shaped scars on the tree came to be known as cat faces. This didn't necessarily kill the tree, but it weakened it, making it more vulnerable to hurricanes and fire, its trunk now covered with one of the most flammable substances on Earth. After 10 years or so of cat facing, the tree would have given up its worth in this capacity. And even if it survived the elements, it would eventually be raised for lumber. That's when the naval stores industry began giving way to logging, sugar, military contracts, and other industries that drove the Savannah port, but it wasn't done making money yet. Around 1903, Georgia chemist Charles Hurdy began experimenting with a more efficient, less damaging way to collect turpentine called the cup and gutter system, prolonging the life of the trees and therefore the naval stores industry itself. Then he helped the logging industry by discovering a way to use all those tapped out trees. Hurdy is mostly famous because 30 years later, he went on to perfect a type of paper produced from the pulp of southern pines, which had previously thought to be unsuitable because of all that resin. This innovation led to another massively profitable economic development from the forests.
Under this new method, you could turn southern pine trees into this usable like commodity paper. And that's what really kickstarts the whole southern paper mill economy. So Hurdy's the key figure there as well. So he kind of sustains naval stores, helps Savannah rise at this very moment, and then perfects the next kind of big technology of pine trees that turns Savannah and the Savannah River into one of the world's paper-making centers.
So turpentine production had declined significantly by the 1940s, but its legacy is still remembered fondly by many families for providing good livelihoods and in jaunty songs about camping out in the piney woods. Portal, Georgia celebrates an annual turpentine parade and festival with demonstrations of the old stills and serving up rosin-fried potatoes. But it's easy to glorify the past. The truth was, working in the turpentine camps sucked. The collection sites were usually in the middle of nowhere, and cutting and collecting from the trees was backbreaking with no respite from the swampy heat and biting bugs. Boiling down resin was difficult and very dangerous, and any injuries incurred went untreated. And while it took skill to accomplish, the production of turpentine was always work for those with little education or other opportunities.
I think it's romanticized in the same way that, pardon me, a lot of shitty work is romanticized after the fact, yeah. Right? When you look back on it, it looks a lot more romantic than it probably was at the time. This was hard, dangerous work that often didn't pay very well. And you can see evidence of that by looking at the workforce, right? Who did the work, and in many cases, who was forced to do the work.
Before emancipation, pitch and tar were extracted exclusively by the enslaved. Afterwards, the conditions weren't much better. Most of the workers were Black and brought in from other states to camp where they were completely dependent on the commissary for their food and necessities. They very often ended up in debt at the end of the season, forcing them back into an endless cycle of labor, much the way coal mining towns indebted their workers to the company store. The turpentine industry also leased convicts from the local prisons, many of whom were Black men sent there for the crime of not having a job. I hope you're as shocked as I was to find out that slavery still operated under the radar long after the last enslaved people learned of their freedom on June 19, 1865, which we now celebrate as a federal holiday of Juneteenth. Some rural areas of the South were still under the auspices of militia districts well into the 20th century. Allendale, South Carolina has records of Black men and women being bought and listed as livestock as recently as 1900. In his book and PBS special, Slavery by Another Name, Southern journalist Douglas Blackman documents how turpentine farms and other examples of debt peonage lasted through the Jim Crow eras into the 1960s. So there's no denying the economic and cultural influence of the pitch and turpentine industry on Savannah, Georgia, and America. And there's no doubt that for some, it was the center of a decent, hardworking life. But it also meant the exploitation of people and the environment. The stories are there in essential Southern reading like Melissa Fay Green's Praying for Sheetrock and Janice Ray's Ecology of a Cracker Childhood. The proof is also in the buried records of small towns. Today, there are still a few groves of virgin longleaf pine here and there, and if you're lucky and paying attention, you might catch a glimpse of one of those giant fox squirrels. But the miles and miles of forest connecting the entire lower quadrant of the continent are gone, stripped and milled, burned and sunk. Turpentine made a few people very rich, and one man in particular. That singularity ended up being his downfall. More after the break. The Savannah Sideways podcast is brought to you by... Is it time for your annual eye exam? Dr. Erica Morrow and the staff at Foresight Unique Eyewear and Eye Care in historic downtown Savannah provide a high-level professional experience that is clearly above the rest. Dr. Morrow provides eye care personalized to your needs. Plus, you'll find the coolest, highest quality selection of frames in town. It's all about the optics. Schedule your appointment today at foresighti.net. When people ask me about the best seafood in Savannah, there's no hesitation. I send them to Bubba Gumbo's on Tybee Island. This is a family-run, water-to-table situation where you can be sure that whatever you're served, perfectly grilled, blackened, or fried, was swimming in the sea this morning, and the guy who reeled it in is probably sitting at the bar. If you'd rather cook at home, BG Seafood Co-op next door can hook you up with the same fresh fruits de mer that they're preparing in the kitchen. And they'll even fillet it all for you and pack it on ice. And should you need a safe harbor to keep your boat, the Tybee Marina where it all goes down is happy to oblige you with a slip. Remember, my good people, friends don't let friends eat imported shrimp. Next time you're hankering for local seafood, head to Bubba Gumbo's and BG Seafood at the Tybee Marina on Lazaretto Creek. Around here, we already know that truth is stranger than fiction, and a lot more interesting, too. If you love cemeteries and you want to delve deep into Savannah's most famous one, you need to meet Don Touton, better known as Bonaventure Don. He offers true stories galore as you stroll through the gravestones. No ghosts, no nonsense, but you might see a wild fox. Whether you're a local or just making a pilgrimage to Savannah's iconic hallowed grounds, Bonaventure Don will give you an experience to last a lifetime, and perhaps beyond. Book a tour now at bonaventuredon.com. So now we know how Spencer Schotter made the fortune that bought the statues that the city acquired and wanted to sell. I have to say, I didn't know anything about turpentine and its lasting economic and social effects before I started asking questions about the Greenwich statues, just like I didn't know how soybeans got started or the complexities behind the burial of Casimir Pulaski. And the statues are not even close to being done serving wild connections between history and the world we know now. As the bloated excesses of the Gilded Age began to wither in the sunlight of the progressive era, part of President Roosevelt's reforms was to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. No, not that Sherman, but yes, the same year as the Tariff Act that was passed to help American industry push out foreign competition. Ohio Senator John Sherman introduced this legislation to prevent the bigwigs from consolidating their holdings even further, and it basically forbade the manipulation of pricing that comes as the result of monopolies. Unlike the tariff that was meant to help corporations, the Sherman Act was enacted to protect the public. Notable outcomes included the breakup of J.P. Morgan's interests in the railroads in 1904 and Rockefeller's Standard Oil conglomerate in 1911. It forced General Electric and the American Tobacco Company to deconsolidate. It's the same law that defanged AT&T in the 80s, and it's why Google is tied up in the courts right now. The board game Monopoly debuted in the midst of all this anti-corporate sentiment. It was developed in 1903 by inventor and early feminist Lizzie Maggie Phillips, who intended for it to be an educational tool to show the economic advantages of individual wealth versus concentrating all of it into the hands of a few. That's right, the origin of everyone's favorite real estate hoarding game was basically tax the rich. In 1906, Spencer Schotter incorporated the Turpentine Trust, which at one point was reported to control 90% of the world's turpentine and rosin businesses by buying from smaller operations around the Southeast. That must have been easy pickings for the Department of Justice, which came for the American Naval Stores Company in 1909. The charges were that the company had depressed the market so much that the individual producers were forced to sell their hard-earned product at rock-bottom prices to their economic overlord. It's interesting to note that in 1907, the New York Times trumpeted that none other than John D. Rockefeller was secretly buying up tracts of longleaf pine forests across the South, with designs on bypassing individual operators and directly producing turpentine and rosin with his own operation. You have to wonder what he knew. Schotter fought the lawsuit with all his might and money, and business appeared as usual outside the office. He was still partying up north at Shadowbrook for the yearly fox hunt and hosted a ball in the fall of 1911 for several hundred of his closest friends. He and Mrs. Schotter even made another trip to Rome in February of 1912 to do a little more shopping, and the statues they bought on that trip, plus those purchased in 1905, all arrived together in July of 1912. Less than a year later, on May 14, 1913, Spencer Schotter was convicted by a federal court in Savannah of violating the terms of the Sherman Act and sentenced to 3 months in prison and to pay a $5,000 fine. 4 other company men were also convicted, but Schotter and Vice President J.F. Cooper were the first men in history to be slapped with jail time under the Sherman Act. They appealed, of course, and the judgment was reversed a few months later. But by then, the American Naval Stores Company had suspended operations, publishing a statement calling itself the first victims of an incensuate crusade against the big business of this country. Okay, so I fancy myself a little something of a wordsmith, but I could not find any sort of relevant definition for the word incensuate. I'm guessing the modern parlance equivalent of incensuate crusade would be witch hunt. Spencer Schotter was ultimately absolved of any crime, but the monopoly breaker suit left him a man of depleted resources. He began liquidating his assets, and in 1916 sold the 250-acre Shadowbrook estate to his frenemy Andrew Carnegie for $350,000. Word has it that the Vanderbilts came to Savannah to check out Greenwich Place at one point, though he ultimately sold the mansion and everything in it and around it in 1917 to the Torrey family from Grosse Pointe, Michigan, who held a fortune from the plate glass industry. Spencer Schotter stayed on in Savannah until he died a few years later in 1920 while visiting his daughter in New York City. His funeral was held at Christ Church on Johnson Square, and he is buried in Bonaventure Cemetery, just a few yards away from where he once directed one of America's most important industries and lived as large as anyone ever had in the history of the world, as Thomas Gamble might have said. Greenwich continued to provide a palatial setting for its new residents. Every fall, the Tories would pull up at the dock in their 100-foot yacht, the Tamarack, and walk through the grand pool house past the double-faced Janus Herms and a pair of marble sphinxes poised as sentries to the garden. They would spend the South's nicest months tooling around the grounds and enjoying the mild breezes from the river. Unbothered by old Savannah's buttoned-up social mores, the Tories hosted fabulous parties at Greenwich for an international roster of guests and offered up the property as a popular movie set. Before Hollywood had its heyday, nearby Jacksonville, Florida was known as the winter film capital of the world, and several silent movies were filmed on location at Greenwich. One of them is 1920's Stolen Moments, starring cinema icon Rudolph Valentino, who can be seen strolling among the Greenwich Gardens in the only known film footage of the statuary in situ. You can see the clip on YouTube along with old black and white stills that give glimpses of the inside of the house posted by eArt Films. We'll leave the link in the episode notes. But Greenwich's leisure and glamour era came to an end in the early morning of January 27, 1923. The newspaper accounts report that around 3 a.m., an electrical fire broke out in the second-floor sewing room and quickly spread through the upstairs bedrooms. The family narrowly escaped the blaze, and the man of the house, Dr. Henry Torrey, burned off his eyebrows, saving his 86-year-old mother-in-law. His 10-year-old daughter jumped from the window into the garden with her nurse as smoke billowed behind them. There were no fatalities, thank goodness. But by the time the firefighters arrived, the whole house was consumed by flames. Everything inside, the famous Eve statue, the mahogany furniture, the imported linens, the gilded walls, the silver, the priceless art collection, was torched as if by General Sherman himself, or maybe ignited like a wounded longleaf pine encrusted in its own sap. The Torrey family lived on the Tamarack for a few months next to the smoldering ruins of their winter retreat, the once regal gardens in shambles. When the $500,000 insurance settlement paid out, they decided not to rebuild. Instead, following the suit of many of their American elite peers, they bought Ossabaw Island, just a short boat ride up the coast. So the Torrey family left Greenwich behind, abandoning Spencer Schotter's ancient Roman statuary collection to the elements and the pickers, symbolic of a country moving on from the iniquities of the Gilded Age into efforts to build a more just society. But the story doesn't end there. That brave little girl who jumped out the window, her name was Eleanor Torrey, better known as Sandy Torrey West. Anybody who's been in Savannah a minute knows Sandy West is legendary for saving Ossabaw Island from developers and playing a key role in Georgia's natural preservation movement. After her family's stint at Greenwich and her brush with the power of fire, Sandy went on to make as searing an impact with her money and time as any person ever could. And after all, she ended up living to be 108. Her story is worthy of a whole episode in itself, coming up next. The Savannah Sideways podcast is brought to you by The Five Spot. Ancient artifacts may be fragile, but the Five Spot's new menu is rock solid. Classics like the signature meatloaf and chicken fried chicken are still part of the permanent collection, while new masterpieces like Todd's famous chili and loaded mac and cheese with Mojo pulled pork and collard greens have joined the rotating exhibit. These curators of comfort food present a lineup of juicy burgers and giant salads for lunch and dinner 7 days a week, plus their famous brunch every Saturday and Sunday that's overflowing with bloodies and mimosas. With locations in Sandfly, Habersham Village, and Richmond Hill, the Five Spot has something delicious for everyone at your table. And by Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum. Housed in the historic Scarborough House, the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum pays homage to America's great maritime past while expanding its lens towards some of the city's most exciting artistic voices. Wander through luxurious galleries of ship models and modern installations, amble amongst exquisite gardens, or attend, or host, an event at the finest open-air venue in town. Book it all at shipsofthesea.org. Special thanks to our friends under the Lincoln Oaks. If you're too dumb for Starland and too ugly for downtown, there is a seat at the table and a spot at the bar for you at 6B, Lone Wolf Lounge, Over Yonder, and Mood Rights. This little slice of shade in Midtown is where the most fun goes down. And by Shot by Somi, award-winning portrait and brand photography for every occasion. A photo isn't just an image, it's a story whispered through light and time. Book your session at shotbysomi.com. The Savannah Sideways podcast is produced by D. Daniels Media, female-owned full podcast production services for businesses, nonprofits, and special projects. Storytelling with a purpose. Go to ddanielsmedia.com.